From Toronto, my name is John Keogh, and welcome to the Future of Food academic series. In this series, I speak with 10 professors for 10 minutes to get their views on what's happening in the food chain and to learn a little bit more about what they're working on. And today, I'm delighted to have with me from Guelph University, Professor Robert Henner. Hello, Robert.
Hello, John.
Robert, delighted to have you with me today, and I'd like to put you on the spot straight away. Can you give us in 1 minute an overview of who you are and a little bit about Guelph University?
Certainly. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Integrative Biology here at the University of Guelph, Canada's food university. We've been developing DNA-based identification systems for biodiversity, a process known as DNA barcoding, for over a decade now. And with the tools that we've used, it allows us to explore a lot of socioeconomically relevant applications of forensic identification. We've done a number of studies helping to link different life stages of species together, identifying things like fish eggs and larvae, identifying stomach contents of who's eating whom in aquatic ecosystems, and even extending that into the human food chain.
Oh, that's pretty amazing. So, Robert, from your vantage point and over your decades of experience, what do you see as the key challenges that the food industry is experiencing today? And are you working on any particular one of those challenges?
So one of the key challenges that we face in this era of increasing globalization is maintaining the authenticity of our foods and ingredients used in food products. The complexity of some of these value chains boggles the mind, and they really are global in scope. And as commodities pass through many different hands, there are opportunities for adulteration or even substitution of cheaper ingredients for more expensive ones, what I would call food fraud. This is a significant problem for industry because it can carry both challenges for food safety as well as significant risks for brand identity if you don't have a good handle on what your suppliers are selling you. And sadly, our traditional approaches to identifying biomaterials rely on having access to intact material. But when we're dealing with foods, we don't always have whole plants or animals that we can easily identify, which means that it's easy to pass things off as a cheaper ingredient for something more expensive. So food fraud is becoming a very significant risk to retailers and the food industry as a whole.
Now, Robert, if you go back, I believe that you were one of the first academics or organizations worldwide to expose fish fraud, maybe about 10 years ago or so. Can you walk us through that process of what you did and the types of fraud, where it was occurring? And also, is there a risk to human health and safety with the particular substitution of fish?
Great questions. So when I originally arrived here at the University of Guelph in 2005 to work on the International Barcode of Life project, one of the roles that I played was to help coordinate a campaign to generate a DNA sequence reference library for fishes. So working with scientists around the world who provided expert identified reference specimens, we could genetically profile those specimens, and that gave us a lookup table that we could use so that we could sequence an unknown, compare that DNA sequence to our reference library, and infer an identification. Obviously, because much of the world counts on seafood as a major source of protein, we were keen to develop a sequence library for fishes to help support sustainable fisheries management and many other applications. But back in about 2007, we thought we would ask the question, is our database mature enough that we could identify fillets that we were encountering in commerce? So we sourced samples from New York City and the Greater Toronto metropolitan area. We sequenced those market samples, compared the results to our library to infer an identification, and then matched that to either the CFIA's fish list or the USDA's seafood list to determine if that species could be marketed under the common name that it was sold as. And if not, we deemed it mislabeled. Surprisingly, we found that about 25% of the fillets that we added were mislabeled, and always species of a lower economic value being substituted for one of a higher value. And since that time, we've repeated this work both across Canada and internationally to find that seafood fraud is systemic in the industry globally. Concerning the question you raised about health impacts, we do see some health risks to food fraud. Some of the less pleasant, but perhaps more benign examples include things like carrieria, where oil fish is substituted for white tuna. Now, oil fish contains a waxy ester in its flesh that much of the human population cannot digest. So when you think you're eating white tuna sushi and you're actually fed oil fish, you may end up with severe gastrointestinal cramping and orange oily diarrhea. It won't kill you, but it's certainly not what you expect to get when you're paying for a nice sushi dinner. Now, that's, as I said, not life-threatening typically, but certainly an unpleasant side effect of fraud that's led countries like Italy and Japan to ban the sale of escolar in those countries. It's still a legitimate species to sell in North American markets, but it should be sold as escolar and not white tuna. We've seen more dramatic cases of risk coming from things like pufferfish being mislabeled as other species like monkfish that have put people in the hospital. So we've worked with the US Food and Drug Administration and CDC and others to identify cases where people have been hospitalized. And I think this speaks to a larger problem in that food fraud is intimately associated with food safety, and that if you don't even know what species you have a traceability problem. And if you have a traceability breakdown, you have a food safety risk.
So Bob, over the 10 years plus that you've been working on this, has the problem gotten any better? Do we have a better handle on it? Is it being addressed effectively?
That's another very good question. So since we've started to see these kinds of market surveys become more widespread around the world, we've seen some response. In the European Union, for example, they moved to include the species name on the packaging, and that combined with increased public awareness and enforcement has seen a dramatic decline in the amount of seafood fraud taking place in the EU. Here in Canada and the United States, we have not really exerted much effort to police this or update our labeling requirements. So it hasn't sadly gotten any better in Canada.
So what guidance would you give to industry, the folks that are buying fish, let's say retailers, restaurants, and what guidance would you give to shoppers?
Excellent question. I would say ask questions of your supplier. Do they know where the seafood came from? Can you buy it with the head on? Or can you look for certain traceability schemes? Things like Marine Stewardship Council's Sustainable Fishery certification seems to have lower rates of mislabeling than general samples on the market. Or TrueID, a new DNA-based third-party certification program that's been developed to help facilitate these kinds of challenges by providing testing and a consumer-facing logo on products that are tested will give you some assurance.
Bob, in 20 seconds or less, can you talk a little bit more about TrueID? What is that?
TrueID is a spin-out company from the University of Guelph we launched back in 2013 that can test food ingredients using these DNA methods to ensure they're what they say they are. And companies using TrueID certification can then use our logo so that they can differentiate their products and let consumers know that they are testing their products and that they are what they say they are.
That's fantastic. Bob, in 30 seconds or less, you're up in front of 50 new scholars, which you are on a regular basis. They're starting off their scholarly journey in science, in food science. What guidance would you typically give them?
That's a tough question. I think, the biggest thing that I can say is to really work at the margins of being interdisciplinary. I think that's where some of the biggest advances are being made. As you know, I don't come from a traditional food science background. I'm a molecular biodiversity scientist who has found myself embroiled in food safety and authenticity because of the application of our research. And I think that really is where some of the exciting gains are to be had for young scholars, is working in a multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary space.
Well, there you have it, folks. All the way from University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada, Professor Robert Hanner. And Professor Hanner, I'd like to thank you sincerely for sharing your wisdom and experience with us today, and wish you and your team continued success.
Thank you, John.